Be right back.
When I did the Cinema Redux thing that got into MoMA, you know what? I could just bang those out forever. And I could make it into a template and just bang that shit out. And I have no interest in doing that. I want to make new things, different things. But there's a lot of artists that they actually do that. They make money and they get collected, and it's just so boring. Complacency is the C word. It's a horrible thing. And once complacency sets in, it's game over.
Without doubt, punk's defiance was a rejection of the stale corporate world. It challenged every aspect of society's ordinary expectations. It was raw and it was loud, and it was built on the belief that anyone could pick up a guitar and make something that mattered. Then, as post-punk bloomed into electropop, acid house emerged from the clubs, swapping drum machines for guitars and hypnotic loops for three-chord anthems. It was no longer just about sound, it was about breaking the system. Then, as the 90s took hold, Manchester's swagger and manipulated breakbeats rewired culture, and the rave scene was born. Bands like Happy Mondays and a guy called Gerald dominated. The underground was no longer just physical, it was digital. Art wasn't just something to make, it was something to generate. And even though the tools of rebellion had changed, the energy remained the same. Creativity was becoming inseparable from code. Artists were using algorithms to reshape visuals, turning digital works into tradable assets, pushing the limits of what creativity could be. In episode 9, we meet someone who spent a lifetime riding these cultural waves, from punk to code, from dance floors to data streams, always pushing his work into the unknown. My name is Richard Smith. I'm an art director and a filmmaker, and I'm your host. Welcome to Destroy.
England, 1976.
They are punk rockers.
Disillusioned youth.
Raw, outrageous and crude.
Anarchy. Striking miners.
The new craze, they tell me.
Mountains of rubbish. The winter of discontent.
Worthless, nasty.
Societal decline. No future. Chaos.
They're a hero.
Welcome to Destroy, a podcast about how the punk movement of 1976 spawned a cultural revolution still being felt today.
You have to destroy in order to create.
Destroy is produced by Be Right Back Studios. Visit berightbackstudios.com/destroy to learn more. If you're enjoying the show, visit our website, destroypunkpodcast.com, to learn more about every episode, including interview transcripts, show notes, music videos, curated playlists, and more. Thank you for listening. The use of technology to reimagine art and culture was always on the periphery of punk. Yet punk's do-it-yourself attitude inspired multiple generations to leverage technology's power to compose and create. At the end of the late 80s, under the influence of acid house, my guest today was kicking around a small coastal town just north of Liverpool called Southport. Not knowing what to do with his life, his early love of video games, computers, and breakbeats brought him to where he is now. He is an artist, and the piece he created, titled The Pandora Variations, was one of the first NFTs to be sold at auction by Sotheby's. And most recently, his groundbreaking collaboration on the film Eno, directed by Gary Hustwit, is already looking Oscar-worthy, which, if you've not seen it, is very well deserved. Please welcome to the show, Mr. Brendan Dawes. Brendan, welcome. Very happy you made time to be here today.
Oh, thank you, Richard. That was a lovely introduction, and thanks.
So, as I said, you grew up in Southport, and that's where you live now, north of Liverpool. And growing up, you were influenced by computers and video games, and you left school at 16. You didn't really know what you wanted to do. Just talk to me about your childhood a little bit, the influence of computers and the love of video games.
Well, it's always interesting to me, the context of your environment and how that influences you. And maybe you only realize that later on. But because I lived in a seaside town where we had tourists in the late 70s, early 80s, we had video game arcades. So every weekend, I would just spend all my time at video arcades. And there was one in particular, which weirdly was in the basement of a hotel. because it was in a basement, it was dark and they had all these like ultraviolet lights in there. It was just like another world. Outside was this Victorian seaside town. And then you sit in this thing and you're like, wow, this is like futuristic.
It's almost like Tron.
Tron, war games, things like that. They were the films that were around at the time. So yeah, these things really influenced me, but it was the experience of it. I thought, wow, this is like really empowering and just very inspirational and wasn't like normal life. And so then I got a Sinclair ZX81 computer. My granddad bought it me. You plugged it into your TV and it came with a book about the programming language BASIC. And you plugged it in and it just had this cursor that just blinked at you. That was it. There's no graphical interface. So it forced you had to learn how to program with it. So that's what I did. And for some reason, I just connected with it. It all seemed to make sense to me.
The interface is very similar to the movie War Games, right?
There's no mouse or anything like that. It didn't have sound. It was white. So you had to be very inventive, and you could make games on it and stuff, but you had to really be very inventive about how you did it. And so that's what I did. And I just taught myself how to code. How did it inspire you? You had control. You weren't consuming, you were creating. And that was like a huge deal. And now we're mostly consumers of stuff. Right. But back then, I wanted to be able to make my own things. And I was just fascinated with the possibilities of it, even though you couldn't really do much with it. Right. It made you think, constraints are always good, I think, in creativity. And there used to be a shop called Dixon's. And it was this computer shop. And they would have these ZX81s like lined up, hooked up to TVs. So I would go in and you could write a program like within seconds, 3 lines, and you'd just put loads of swear words on the screen. And it would just scroll up and down infinite. It would run forever. I love that. You go into this electronic shop and you're being mischievous and devious and using this new computer to do all this stuff, and probably nobody knew how to turn it off. Well, they didn't. Like that was the thing, because they didn't know how to shut it off. So I'd have it saying bollocks or whatever it is. And, it was just funny. I would do stuff like that. I wasn't ever going to steal anything or anything like that. But to me, it's kind of like early form digital graffiti in a way. That must have been brilliant. I guess it taught me the power of these things very early on, that you could have command of these things. I want to unpack a little bit your music love. I want to understand how that was motivating you, what was inspiring you.
I was trying to think in relation to your podcast, and in 75, I was 9.
Okay.
So I started to get into music. It's more the early 80s.
Okay.
New romantic.
Right.
All kinds of stuff. And I guess I really got into it when I got into the whole rave scene in Manchester, because I'd started a sound engineering course. This is in the late 80s.
Like music production?
Yeah. So I went and did a sound recording course in Manchester as Spirit Recording Studios. And in the same class was Graham Massey, who then went on to form 808 State. I was really into mixing and vinyl mixes and stuff. My heroes were like Steinsky and the Mass Media and Cold Core and Eric B. and all these kind of people that use samples and bits of vinyl and all this stuff to make new things with. Things that, again, these things existed, and then you manipulate them to create new things. And then with Acid House, it was a digital sound, but they used like an MC202 from Roland and stuff. So I had one of those. Right. I think I had an MC303. And the 303 was like the Acid House machine. So you know all that beep, 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 all that kind of stuff. That came from that. And I bought one secondhand and I was like, this is amazing. So yeah, I'm doing all this and I'm trying to make these tunes. So all these parts are starting to come together.
What brought you to that point, wanting to be a recording engineer?
Well, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I left school at 16. I always went to school, but I didn't really enjoy it. The best class I did the best in was art. But I left school with like pretty much no qualifications. I was a photographer for a couple of years, doing news photography, a bit of sports as well,
Right.
that kind of stuff. But I didn't feel it was my thing. And there was like a sound engineering course, and I thought I'd go for that because it just sounded fun and experimental and a bit different. I always knew in a way that I wasn't going to have the normal job. I knew that at school. I just felt different. I thought I'm not going to have a 9-to-5 job. And then I got into the music stuff, and because you could buy the Atari ST and it had these MIDI ports, of course, and that was the music computer. So I basically just started messing around with music and sound, and I'd already been a DJ making my own mixes and selling them illegally and making like breakbeat albums for a record company in London.
Really?
Yeah, I would go around vinyl record shops and find obscure breakbeats.
I remember my brother telling me about that phenomenon. I was like, people buy records like that or buy whatever like that? It makes no sense to me.
I would compile these breakbeat albums, but I was using tape. I didn't even have a sampler. I remember I was using Ampex tape, quarter-inch tape, and I would record the loop multiple times and then splice it together manually. And I remember sending the tape down the first time I'd done these bits for this album.
Yeah.
And the guy who owned the record label, he rang me up. He said, "Brendan, you can buy a sampling." I said, "Well, I can't afford one." He said, "There's nothing wrong with it. You cannot tell. It's beautifully done, but how long does it take?" I said, "Fucking hours." So I got into that, and then I started to get a bit more equipment and got into sequencing with computers and started making dance music. And I took a cassette into 3 Beat Music in Liverpool, which is a record shop, but they also had a label.
Right.
And I was working in a factory at the time because I was getting married, and I was working in an electronics factory drilling holes in fiberglass.
Your backstory is fascinating.
Listen, let me tell you now, I've had a lovely life. I think I always like the phrase, luck has to find you working. I often think back, what if I just went for my meat and potato pie, just sat in the car and just moaned?
I love that.
So, I took this cassette in thinking they're never going to ring me. And they rang that week, the following week, they said, "Come in and talk to us. We want to release a couple of singles." So I thought, wow, this is it. I've
made it.
This is it. I've made it. And I released like a couple of 12-inch singles. And my brother, we played the club that would then become Cream, before Cream. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be on stage, I need someone else with me. So my brother, who was massively into like ease and drugs and everything, I said, "Do you want to stand on stage with me?" And he says, "Yeah." So he pretended to play the keyboards. The whole thing was a PA. It was all on tape. Yeah, so that was fun, but I made about 400 quid.
So you went from wanting to be a musician, making music.
Yeah.
Then the computer elements of the music making inspired you to move to the next whatever.
I think that's the commonality. The computer was like this amazing box,
right,
where I could make creative things. I always wanted to make stuff in some form. Back then it was music, because I'd done this sound engineering course and they taught you how to use a sequencer and things, machines. But computers, I just thought there's this amazing thing where you could type into it and make it do stuff. I don't know why, but it just spoke to me. It just made sense to me how you make decisions and loops and things.
I think what was interesting, you said about how you got into music. There's a part of the premise of the show is that there's a correlation, all of these events, like a journey, starting with that time, 75-ish, and then going into the early 80s, and then house music, acid house, techno, all of that. The music in many ways was the thing that spurned one thing into the next.
So I'm not trained in programming. I wasn't a musician. I didn't even have qualification. I didn't go to university. So even though obviously I was too young for the whole punk thing,
right,
I still looked at that whole aesthetic or that whole manifesto behind it, really, the idea of punk. But my execution of it eventually would take the form of code, and the power that gave me of being able to control this box. So I think that's maybe the correlation. The message of the podcast is you don't have to follow the rules. It's not about just having a successful career. I'm not talking about monetary value. I mean, creatively successful or fulfilled or whatever. So you don't have to follow the traditional route.
Yeah.
If I look back on my career, I think there's a few commonalities, but one of them is that I was always using what Duchamp might call as ready-made. So back then it was samples, or it was my influences were Cold Cut and Steinsky and people like that, which is why I was looking for these breakbeats. So I was using things that existed, but then I would twist them into different forms, which is what you did when you were a mix DJ or a scratch DJ or when you put these records together from samples. I think that's what I'm still doing. Right. I just use code, and a lot of it's visual now. The Eno film is very much that. It's footage, but then we scramble it all and put it together in different ways. Right. There's also generative scenes that are all generated in, real time and all that. Yeah. But again, it's all from taking existing stuff and just looking at it in different ways.
What I like a lot about what you said is that one, there's a connection, and two, that you're very passionate, right? It feels like it was fuel for you.
And I think it's the subconscious thing, though, as well. I think it's probably more subconscious for me. And I think pretty much most of the work that I've made, even like taking data and representing it in different ways, is that idea that, which to me is a very punk thing, but that definitely comes from my music background, definitely, the idea of sound. I always say data by itself is not enough. Data needs poetry. And by that, I'm meaning that I'm looking for the in-between things, the things that resonate with people. I think it's this unknown quantity, this X factor, fuzziness, slightly messy, like cracks in the concrete, whatever it is, they're the interesting things. There's a space between the notes. And I wanted to try and do that with data, and that's made a name for myself. And I got a lot of work because of it.
So I know you've been flying all over the world promoting the Eno film, talking about its creation. And, for me, it's a truly remarkable work of art. And I'm curious how the film came about.
Well, I've known Gary. I first met him at a South by Southwest conference panel. A friend of ours, Jim Coodle, who's one of the creators of the Field Notebooks. He invited me onto this panel, and I went over to Austin, Texas, and I met Gary for the first time. And we were on this panel and talking about creativity and all that kind of stuff. And we just became friends from then on. And over the years, we've always wanted to work on something together. And some things we've kicked around, but never really manifested anything. And we've always been talking. And in 2019, in January, Gary emailed me, and he had this idea for a film that is different every time it's shown. So using a generative process created with software. And would I be interested in working on it? And I just emailed back and said, yeah, sounds amazing. And so we then started on making a prototype. Brian Eno's name wasn't mentioned at all at this point. We started to use as a kind of demo. Gary's previous film was about the designer Dieter Rams. So we had all that footage. So I started building this system that created this movie on the fly, compositing things and all kinds of stuff.
You've been making films or moving imagery, or however you want to describe it, for a while before that, correct? Was Gary familiar with that?
Yeah, why he was interested in working with me. He
got it.
He loves a lot of my previous work, and weirdly, a lot of my previous stuff has been informed or inspired by films and cinema. The first work I got into the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which was shown in 2008, and was this thing called Cinema Redux.
Right.
And it's a still image, and it shows an entire film in one image. So each row is 60 frames, and then it builds all these rows up of little images, little thumbnails, which I created in 2004, just playing around.
Wow.
And then MoMA got in touch in 2007 and said, oh, we've seen this work on the internet, and we've got this exhibition called Design in the Elastic Mind, opening in 2008, and we'd like to feature this work. And that obviously blew my mind because I'd never been to art school. I didn't have any connection with anyone at MoMA. So it shows the power of the internet and putting your work out there, just doing stuff, making stuff.
Right.
So yeah, Gary had seen that, and we knew my other work. So yeah, long story short, because Brian had done the soundtrack to his Dieter Rams film, he knew he had a bit of an in with Brian.
So as you mentioned, it's a generative film. So explain that a little bit to me, how that works.
Yeah, so there's pre-edited scenes, and we kind of pin scenes, so the beginning and the end are the same, but then the rest is chosen by the system. But we can also impose a kind of narrative arc. So it's not like complete chaos randomness. We're giving it an emotional compass, as it were. So that was the hard stuff to figure out, to do that.
Right.
Because people watch it and think it's just going to be a load of random clips, and it's not. But then there's millions and millions of permutations.
I remember growing up, I used to love those books on rock family history.
Yeah.
And I guess where this comes from is that notion of like everything is connected.
Yeah.
It's such a sprawling mass. I think the film that you and Gary have made, it's almost like a visualization of this sprawling mass.
When Gary approached him originally, he turned Gary down because he didn't want to make a documentary about his life.
Yeah, right.
He said there's more than one truth about someone.
Right.
And he hated documentaries that present one idea. So when Gary came to me, it was just the idea of a film that is never the same twice. That was the thing we were working on. And then we did a prototype and we took it to Brian, and Gary took it to him and he said, look, this is what we're thinking. And Brian was like, yeah, this is really cool. Let's do it. Okay. So, and obviously Brian is the perfect subject for a documentary that is generative. So that's the thing that people love. It shows different aspects of Brian every time you go and see it. And you might get the Roxy music bit, you might get the art school, you might not. You might get ambient music, you might not get ambient music, you might get all these light sculptures. But it is an optimistic film. And it talks about climate change as well at the end, because the beginning and the end are the same. It's very inspirational about creativity and art and why we have art in our lives. So people love it for that. But the reaction to the film has been beyond our expectations. It's all a bit mad, really. I remember being told we got into Sundance. I was like, we haven't even got, I've got to make this thing. And there was a crucial moment where I got it to a certain level, and then Gary was like, can you come out to New York for a week to work with us, me and the two editors? It'd be good to have you in the same room. So I went out there for 4 or 5 days, and during this screening as well. And I watched the screening, and I came out, and Maya, one of the editors, said, what do you think, Brendan? I said, I think I've just watched something where it says it's not generative. So I then, couldn't sleep that night, and we went back to the office the next day. So I had a rant about it. And Gary, he wished he'd filmed all this because it was like...
Right.
And so it galvanized the idea of the movie, that it needed to be made with software. That was the whole point of it. It couldn't be a lie. And so when I was leaving, I was like, has it been worth me coming over? And Gary was like, are you fucking kidding me?
So at that point, how was it constructed?
I didn't realize. So I built the software, but there were still a few problems with it. And so Gary had put a cut together that was done in Premiere, was edited.
Right, I see.
And that's what was screened. And I didn't know this. So we watched this film. I think he told me just before we screened it. And I was like, fucking what? I've just made this software, but it had been cut together in Premiere. And I was like, what? So that really like messed with my head. So that's why I said what I said when we came out cinema.
But it sounds like that was like a really pivotal moment.
Yeah, it was. It absolutely was. It really was. Gary still talks about it. Me and the editors, we were such great friends. And that was the thing. I had to learn how to work with the editors from their point of view, because they edited together all these individual scenes that are fucking amazing. And so, yeah, it's been a gift. The whole thing is going around the world, doing it live or doing Q&As. And, you know, Sundance was incredible.
I want to go back to one thing as you're talking, the influence of punk. So I was thinking about what you're doing currently, the Eno film. And, you know, as somebody who's always been at the forefront of music and challenging musicians to work differently. And so it's sort of interesting that you are continuing to enable that journey.
Well, you know what? There was something that Brian said. One was when he was talking about his time in, you know, it was an interview when he was at art school and stuff. And he was saying that in this Roxy Music time, he moved from the element of skill to the element of judgment. So he realized that he wasn't a great musician, but what he could do, he could twiddle all these things and he could judge whether it was good or it sounded interesting at least.
Right.
And there was like this old interview where he wore a tie-dye thing. And he describes tie-dye as bad dyeing. You know, it's like he realized, he said, he's made a career out of failing well. So when I was watching all this, particularly the skill versus judgment thing, 'cause there's way more talented programmers than me and stuff, but the ability that I have is to be able to judge it to make something interesting, where a lot of coders and programmers, they just get into the real geekery of it.
Right.
Or then the output doesn't resonate. And a lot of the stuff I do is really simple from a punk or the idea of just not worrying about the rules and making your own rules and blowing things up. I think there's more interesting things happen when you're on the edge of oblivion. You're on the edge, you know, destroying things. I think that's where you should always be as an artist. I always describe it as there's the things you know, and outside of that, much bigger is the things you don't know. And you should place yourself as an artist on that event horizon between the two.
Right.
You shouldn't be like in the middle of all the things because that's boring.
Right.
That's why, and I get why some artists, particularly in the digital sphere, they just bang out the same stuff. And I get it because it makes them money and it's easier. For me, I've always found that a bit boring, and I just don't want to do that. So I'm just constantly looking to do new things or work in new mediums or work with new people. So that's what interests me.
You describe yourself as an artist, but in the digital sense, or you don't even qualify it in that way?
It's such a loaded word. We always has a problem with the word artist. And so I thought I'm a designer, right? But I think the word designer suggests that you're like solving problems.
Right.
And I'm providing answers. I don't think I'm providing answers, nor do I want to. I want to leave people with more questions. So it feels to me that what I do is more art-led because no one employs me to design a logo or whatever. It is more like as an artist. And I just embrace it now because like I said, it's quite loaded. You know, and you're at like a family party and someone goes, "What do you do?" And I used to go, "Oh, I make things." And now I just go, "I'm an artist," and then just wait for the silence. And they go, "Oh, they're like, you're unemployed then, are you?"
Would you like some more Brussels sprouts?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Get me away from this weirdo. So I don't even qualify it anymore.
Hey there, sorry for the interruption, but if you're enjoying the show, please leave a review or a comment. For the latest news and updates, make sure to also follow us on Instagram at Destroy Punk Podcast. Thank you, and now back to the show.
You know, I know you sold some stuff in Sotheby's. that right?
Yeah, I've done a couple of Sotheby's auctions, a couple of Christie's, various other auctions. I got well into the NFT scene in 2021. Did change a lot of things for me, which was amazing. I mean, the first NFT sold in an auction house in Paris was mine. And
Wow.
I think the first NFT sold in an auction house in China was mine. I had basically made like this abstract sculpture from the fight scene at the end of Kill Bill Volume 1. So again, it's manipulating movies and things. And it was called Black Mamba's Revenge. And it was bought in an hour. But obviously NFTs was a whole phenomenon, and people are saying that they're dead, and yet they are still being sold and collected. Not in the same way. But what was interesting for me was it then got me in front of contemporary art galleries who already had digital artists. And a gallery in Mayfair called Gazelli Art House, they got in touch. And I did a group show with them, and then they said, oh, we want to represent you. So I've done various shows with them, and they look after my work now, and they're like a family to me, and they're amazing. And they're a full-on contemporary art gallery. And so it opened a lot of doors for me.
So as you're talking, I'm thinking outside of the coding aspect, the technology aspect, which seems like a means to the end. What would you say your art is all about? What are you trying to say?
Yeah, I want it to resonate. Well, here's the thing. I don't think the work is completed, if it's ever completed. It's not finished until someone sees it and experiences it. And so that completes the loop. If no one sees the work, I don't think the work actually exists.
Interesting. It's that context.
What I'm trying to do. Yeah, I'm guessing for me, it's a conduit it's a lens to look at the world in a different way.
Yeah.
And just stop and question things. The best comments I've had, there was one guy who said, this completely stopped me in my tracks. I thought, job done. But I'm not thinking of that when I'm making it.
No.
I'm just making, because it's the only thing I know how to do. But when someone says that, it means a lot, or it made them cry, or it made them, lots of people have seen the Eno film, they've been in tears watching it. And that's obviously because of Brian and what he's saying and all that. But you make this work, and if it doesn't resonate with someone, I think it's failed. And if people hate it, I don't think I ever want to make work that people go, yeah, it's all right. No, you want it to be like extremes of like, fuck me, I hate that work, or wow, I really like it. I think I don't just want to make an Instagram like-making machine. Some people just do. I'm not interested in that kind of shit. So, yeah, I think it's that. I think it's hard to describe sometimes why you do what you do.
For me, I've always thought that it comes from wanting to have a voice. So wanting to be a little subversive, sorry. And I think that's where punk really had an impact on me, because it was like, oh, wow, it legitimized a little bit the ability to take on the establishment. I never put myself out there. I didn't really dress like a punk. I didn't really do all of that. All of that inspiration led me to what I do, because it gave me a way to express myself. Starting out as a designer, oh yeah, I can now have a voice. Sorry, that was like a confession just
No, I think that's really interesting. I think creating anything is an egotistical act, because you're essentially playing, you're like God in your own environment.
Yeah.
Whether that's an environment as a piece of paper or whatever. So I always felt that's what that is. So when people say, I really like that, it's a hell of a thing. It's a thing you've created from nothing, and now it deserves a place in the world. And oftentimes I think you're creating work that doesn't exist in any other form. So therefore you feel you need to make it exist. No, with Gary as well, he wanted to make films that he wanted to watch. Right. But they didn't exist. So that's why he made Helvetica and God knows what. So I guess it's a similar thing, but it's always interesting. I'm just reading Nick Cave's book at the minute, which is incredible. There's a lot of things in there about his journey and creativity and stuff. But I just find all those conversations really interesting.
Something you also touched on, and I wanted to ask was, so you met Gary at South by Southwest, but when I looked at some of your work, there's a lot of familiarity with existing work and the Eno film. So is that where a lot of the inspiration came from?
Well, it's weird. I was only recently, I think I posted on Instagram yesterday about this thing I made in 1998 where you could re-edit the shower scene in Psycho.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
Well, I've only recently realized it was like an early prototype in a way. I was massive, still am obviously massive Alfred Hitchcock fan. And back then I was trying to make a name for myself in the whole web design and stuff like that and interaction design. And I'd done a site about Soul Bass. And the first ever Soul Bass website, not unofficially, and that got a lot of press. And so an offshoot of that was this Psycho thing, this little online application where you could re-edit the shower scene and then you could save your own version. It was quite disturbing how people titled them. Someone was like, "Die, bitch." And I think some people were obviously a bit disturbed. But anyway, it was a timeline and you could drop things in a timeline and it would generate this thing. And it was only recently that I thought, bloody hell, I forgot that I'd made that long ago. So yeah, and I made a lot back then. I made a lot of like interface things, and that was kind of what I was known for, was weird interfaces and just things that didn't look like anything else. So, so I guess I've always seen the idea of software applications in an artful way anyway, because to me, why can't they be artworks? Why can't software that you've made be a piece of art? I didn't think of it like that back then, but that's just was my outlet for making things. I always say you make a thing to make a thing. You're making a thing, you're making a thing that makes a thing. So, which is the whole point of generative work. I've always done that. So there is these like little connections with what I'm doing now from way back.
Interesting.
You strike me as somebody who's not afraid of failure, or you're not afraid of imperfection, or you want to see what happens.
I mean, you could say, you watch like a Kubrick movie, and I was watching 2001 again the other day, and you look at that movie and God, some of it's like, how did they even film this? And it's a perfect science fiction film, but I'm sure if Kubrick looked at it, he'd go, nah, that bit's not right. And I'm sure that's how it was. So you aim for perfection, but you always want these little, like I said, these little things that have these little cracks in them. That I think that's what defines a bit of humanity in the work. I think if it's too perfect. So you want that little bit of naivety in it, I think. That's the kind of stuff that I'm interested in. The whole point about being on the edge, there's the things you know, and then the other side of that is the things you don't know, which is huge and infinite. And you want to position yourself between those two things. You don't want to be like right in the middle of the things you know, because that's boring. So you want to be always on the edge of that unfamiliarity. That's where you want to position yourself as an artist, and I think as any creative person. That's what fuels you. Like, what if I do this? It could be terrible, and it could blow my computer up, or whatever it is, or it could be a disastrous business fail. You have to give it a go because it's actually way more interesting. So this idea of oblivion, and also from making a generative system where you're making a system where you have rules and then you press a button up and then the system makes itself. There's a vulnerability to that. You're putting yourself in a vulnerable position because you're not quite sure what it's going to make. Put the rules in place like a kind of mini god, but this still could go different places. And I love that aspect. I think it speaks to that idea of this like tension between oblivion and success.
It's amazing how your life has been this series of stumbles and falls. But somehow it's less about falling over. You have always gotten where you wanted to go, making a name for yourself.
I think the main thing is being adaptive to the culture and the times. That's the number one thing. And I've only realized this recently. You've got to adapt. That's what Darwin said. It's not about survival of the fittest. It's about those that can adapt to the surroundings. They're the ones that survive. And so I've always managed to find a way to adapt to my surroundings culturally and technology, society, whatever. I've always managed to find a way to understand what the zeitgeist is somehow, which is weird because I don't live in London and I'm miles from anywhere like that. Yeah, that's the number one lesson I've learned in my life, is to adapt. Because if you don't, you become like stone and you just refuse to change. I've just learned to adapt to the times. And now it's the AI and stuff. But the discussion around AI, obviously you see a lot of it. It just steals people's work and it's like a very naive reaction to it. So we can't discount AI completely, and we shouldn't, because it's another tool that can lead to areas that we've not even thought of. I think that's what we need to hold on to. There's lots of concerns, absolutely, but you don't want to discount it. I think there's a lot of creatives and artists who really do get it and see that it's a new form of creativity. And I think it's best when it's combined with human beings. The way I use it, I'm creating like the forms of a thing myself, but then I'm using AI to then augment it. But it cannot make what I've seen without me, that first bit. I'm still crafting everything. It's not like going in some magic porridge pot. I'm still having to figure out how it does that. But that, for me, that's absolutely fascinating, a new form of beauty.
I was curious what's next for you. And just as you were talking, it made me think, you've obviously had this crazy year with the Eno film, and obviously that's taking you here, there, and everywhere. And I don't even know if you think in those terms of what's next.
Practically what's next. Me and Gary have started our own company to do other film projects. We've already got the next one lined up that is not our project. We're consulting on. We go to New York in January for a workshop on that, and then a couple of other big projects that are very exciting. Could be huge, but we'll see where that goes. But then there's the other side. I'm represented by a gallery in London, Gazelle Art House. Mila, who owns the gallery, had not seen the film before. She came and she was blown away. And then another art guy was there, and they were both saying to me, where does this leave you, though, as your art practice? Are you just going to be like you and Gary now?
Right.
No, I just see this as another element to what I do. I'm still exploring, making things, probably going to do a new solo show next year. I'm working on ideas for that. But yeah, I honestly... I don't really know where it's going to go. I think I'm just trying to constantly learn all the time, I think, of new things and new inputs.
Coming back to what you said a minute ago, this is what you do. This is what makes you happy or gets you excited or what motivates you. And in many ways, continuing to do more of the same.
I want to make work that is remembered. And leaves a mark. And not everything I do does that. Even David Bowie did The Laughing Gnome. You make lots of shitty things, but then hopefully you then make something significant. So I think that's what's been the true joy with this film. But yeah, so that was the thing that keep me going.
And it seems that you get a lot from people's interpretations or the fact that you put it out there and it gives it meaning. And I love that.
And also, they bring something else to it that I didn't even, or it resonates in a way that I didn't. That's the best thing.
You mentioned Marcel Duchamp, but to me, that is everything. Is it a work of art? Is a urinal or a urinal? I never remember the pronunciation. That's the American. Me again. It's an example that I try to express to everybody I work with. Coming from an agency, advertising agency, branding agency world, everyone is afraid It's always about what you shouldn't do or will the client be happy? Sometimes it's just like, let's just do it. Let's just see what happens.
There's a piece in the Eno film where Brian talks about that piece in particular.
Yeah.
The idea of his ready-mades, these things that already exist, and now you can take those and put them in other artworks and make new things from them. When I was making breakbeats and all that kind of stuff, I didn't know you could term those as ready-mades. So I realized there was a correlation with the ethos of Marcel Duchamp and all the whole absurdity of Dadaism and all that kind of stuff. Dadaism came out of a response to the horrors of the First World War. The reason it's absurd is because of that. Those things have just always interested me. I'm not interested in the familiar. I think you should always make a stranger of familiarity. I could have, when I did the Cinema Redux thing that got into MoMA, you know what? I could just bang those out forever. And ditto with a lot of my work. I could just make it into a template and just bang that shit out. And I have no interest in doing that. I want to make new things, different things. But there's a lot of artists that they actually do that. They make money and they get collected, and it's just so boring because they've just become familiar with things. They've become familiar with their own processes. They're not trying new things because they've become for complacency. Complacency is the C word. It's a horrible thing. And once complacency sets in, it's game over.
I always describe it as when I do like talks at unis and stuff, I always say, you've got to deviate from the expected.
Right.
When you do that, it's like having some people punks swear on Nationwide was like, Jesus. It was like, and it's still being talked about now. This is why you should never follow trends, because you're just then following everyone else and you're just then in the noise and you don't stick out. So I've never followed trends at all. So it's good to deviate from the everyday and then what are the expected.
Something you mentioned, you said that you'd worked with Peter Saville.
That was when Peter was creative director of Manchester. So the agency I was with at the time, they were doing a massive rebrand. And so we had a lot of meetings with Peter where we'd show him like the idea for the website and stuff like that. And he often commented on the typography choice and that kind of thing. But as he said to you, he's not into technology. He doesn't use technology. So he found it all quite, as he described it, quite quaint. I worked with Tony Wilson as well. And he rang me up once and he said, Brendan, he said, what would it sound like if you could hear the Happy Mondays being downloaded? I said, well, he said, could you make some code to do it? I said, yeah. So I made this like quick little software application where you could put like any song in, but in this case, Happy Mondays.
Right.
I can't remember which one it was. And it like, you heard the code version of it, right? And so what Tony did, because he was clever, he didn't have any of the rights to the Happy Mondays songs. And so I'd created this piece. So that's what Tony did. We just gave you dangerous ideas. I think that's what, Gary, when Gary emailed me, it was the dangerous idea. How do you make a film? It's never the same again. So, these people are amazing to have in your lives. They just drop these ideas on you and you can either say no or you can say, I think I can figure something out.
I feel like I could keep chatting forever, but I'm going to let you go because I know it's getting late for you and it's probably getting close to dinner time. But Brendan, thank you so much for making time again. And like I said, I know you've been super busy. I wish you luck with so many of these things.
Next week, I'm actually doing a podcast interview, a video, and it's about Savile Row tailoring.
What?
Because that's the kind of stuff that I wear.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Wow, brilliant.
So I've now ingratiated myself to be, again, trying to be like, I think I want to be known for dressing well and stuff. And I've managed to do that so much that I've now been invited on to be interviewed.
You just blew my mind with that. That was, wow. I've got to see these Savile Row pictures. That's brilliant.
It's brilliant.
You know, I appreciate craft in all its forms. So
Totally, yeah. No, I can tell that. That's
Thank
brilliant.
you.
And I'm honored that you are on the show. So thank you.
Well, listen, I'm honoured to be on the show. You know, I right from episode 1, I loved what you were doing, and the Peter Saville episode is fantastic. So to be asked to be on it is a real thrill. So thank you again.
Well, I'm hoping that it achieves greatness like yourself.
I'm sure it will.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Cheers, mate.
Cheers. See ya.
Bye.
Bye. My name is Richard Smith, and I'm your host. I'm a filmmaker and art director, and once upon a time I was part of the big 80s. I designed record covers for Depeche Mode, I danced with Bono, discussed art with Mick Jagger, and drank tea with Susie Sue. I also grew up during those turbulent times in England in the late 70s and was driven by the do-it-yourself ethos of punk. I obsessed over bands like Joy Division and New Order and went on to work for the album cover designer Peter Saville. I believe that year, that moment in 1976, when a bunch of foul-mouthed yobs cursed and swore on national television, changed the future of culture forever, and is what brought us to where we are today. So where do we go from here? Will emerging new technologies be the catalyst that tears down the walls of mediocrity, throwing culture and society into chaos and revolution again? We'll have to wait and see. This has been another episode of Destroy. Thank you for listening. Destroy is a Be Right Back Studios production. Learn more at BeRightBackStudios.com. And please tune in again for another episode of Destroy, the Influence of Punk podcast, wherever you listen or download. Be right back.